No. Speaker on.
Okay, so we can, sorry. Okay, so now we can start. So we can start now the event on the role of international development cooperation in the face of climate change. So this is an event organized by AECID, that's the Spanish cooperation agency for development and cooperation, AECID. And I'm Sebastián Nieto, I'm the head of Latin America and the Caribbean at the OECD Development Center. So it's a pleasure to be here with you and to discuss this topic that is crucial for the climate change, and is how the international cooperation can help to achieve the commitments that we have. And that's crucial here at the COP27 when we talk about the commitments and at the end how to implement what we have in mind. So here what we're going to have today is about two panels in which we are going to discuss a lot about the SDG 13, where we have the issues related to how to fight against climate change, and at the end of the day, the commitment that we have, and in particular from developing countries to achieve the 100 billion US dollar needed to fight against climate change in developing economies. So certainly the amount of money is important, but at the end of the day, what kind of international cooperation is needed is important as well. So that's one of the issues that we're going to discuss today, taking into account certainly the current situation that we have in emerging economies, in particular in countries affected by the pandemic and where the recovery remains still a pending issue, and with new crises that are into the climate change crisis, like the energy crisis that we have now and the challenges related to the power chain problems that we have today for emerging economies. So that's just in a nutshell what we have for the discussion today. But before starting with the two panels that we have, let me leave the floor to Anton Leis, the director of the Spanish Cooperation Agency for Development, AECID, and where we have a good partnership from the OECD, of course, with AECID. Anton.
Muchas gracias, Sebastián. Well, thank you, first of all, for joining us today. You know the context. We live in a world of crisis with E in plural. Crisis is becoming the new normal. We barely overcame COVID. We have food security, we have energy, but we should not lose sight of actually the most fundamental and most structural of all of these crises, which is the climate crisis. And we all know that we are all affected by it, but some people are more affected than others. We see it, what happened in the floodings in Pakistan, droughts in the Horn of Africa, but just the fires at home in Spain this summer. Africa sends 4% of emissions, but the climate crisis has a toll of about 5 to 15% of GDP. So that means we need to act, but we don't need to act everywhere in the same way. And this is the COP where we are all rolling out our sleeves and actually trying to get the job done. Negotiators have largely accomplished their work. Like, we have more or less a clear path on what we need on both adaptation and mitigation, but it is now the time to get the job done. And actually, if you look at this event and the people that are here with us, international organizations, governments, NGOs, civil society, and youth, actually the common denominator is that we are implementers. We do things, and it's actually the time to act. The questions we are addressing today is how we can speed up climate action, on mitigation, but crucially, and based on the needs of developing countries, and this is a international development cooperation discussion, on adaptation. What's the role of development cooperation? How can we help? What are the mistakes we should avoid? What we should be focusing on? Just 3 or 4 ideas on my side to kick off. first we need financing with a sense of urgency. We are falling short of the 100 billion USD target. There is the question, of course, what flows are needed. I think the answer is simple. We need all of them. We need ODA, and I think the question should not be whether we should use ODA or not, but rather, can we all leverage additional funds? The question is, we should not be competing for the same resources and saying, let's go green, let's go social. We actually need to increase resources. And I think on Spain's side, we are playing our part. We have bold and ambitious objectives when it comes to climate finance. Our Prime Minister committed to an increase of 50% by 2025, but also on ODA. We are drafting now new legislation and a new comprehensive reform of our development cooperation system, and we are aiming to reach 0.7 in 2030 in line with our international commitments. And we're getting the job done. We started in 2017 on 0.19, which is a figure I'm not very proud to mention, but we are already, next year we will be in 0.34. So we are getting there. And we are greening our ODA. Our Prime Minister yesterday made some announcements, launched this initiative on drought resilience, which I think is very important. And I think only next year we will be providing through the agency 85 million in grants and 80 million in loans. And we want to work with others. Number two, I think what we need is dialogue. We need to listen. There is, of course, mitigation that is very important in donor countries and is, of course, a global agenda. But we need to listen, and we need to work more on adaptation, on resilience. And we need to look at other sectors, and some of them are represented in this panel, that are not, let's say, 100% climate, but that are absolutely important to the climate agenda, to adaptation and mitigation. Sustainable and resilient agriculture, biodiversity and forestry, water management, all of these are also very important in the agenda. Number three, I would say we need to avoid a tunnel vision. This is a transformation. It's probably the most significant transformation the world will undergo since the Industrial Revolution. We need the Ministries of Environment, but this is a whole of society, whole of government transformation, and we need this transformation to be just. If the transformation, if the green transition is not just, we may not see a transition at all, either because it will be stopped at the polling stations or on the streets or elsewhere. But we need to ensure that this green transition goes hand in hand with a societal transition to make sure that no one is really left behind. And number four, we need partnership. We need SDGs 17, and I think with this humble contribution with this event, we want to hear from others, and we want to work with others. We need to work with the private sector. It's absolutely fundamental on the financing agenda, but beyond. We need to work with international organizations, humanitarian organizations, also those doing long-term development, and we need to work with civil society and also with youth, and I'm particularly pleased that we have one of our Spanish young leaders joining the discussion later today. So that's all on my side. Let's enjoy the discussion and looking forward to participate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anton Leis, Director of the IEC. So let's start with the first panel. The first panel is about the role of international cooperation to support emerging economies, and in particular to see what's going on in terms of sectors, instruments, ODA, but also beyond ODA. What kind of international cooperation is needed to achieve the climate change goals that we have in around the world, and in particular in emerging economies. So that's what we have in the first panel. The second panel is going to be more on how to mainstream the climate action across international development programs and projects. But as Anton mentioned, I mean, we are going to have different actors. We're going to have international organizations, governments, civil society, youth, and in this first panel we have with us Jennifer Sara. She's the Director of Climate Global Practice at the World Bank. Then we have Cecile Max Aberkamp, the Director of that's a long name, Tracking Action to Transform Food and Land Use Systems at the at the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network. And we have as well with us Álvaro Lario, the President of the International Fund for Agriculture Development. later on, we are going to have with us the minister from Egypt in water resources and irrigation, the minister Hani Sewilam with us. So let's start with Alvaro and to talk about the key role that you are having in terms of food security in the most remote areas, and how at the end to combine with the climate adaptation policies that are needed.
Hear me? Yeah, okay, thank you, sorry. So first of all, before being the president of the United Nations Agency and IFI, I'm also a Spanish national. So in this sense, I want to commend Spain and ICID for coming back with an increased financing and mobilizing. I think it really shows the commitment of the government. So let me first start by thanking them. For us, we are, as I said, a United Nations agency. We're very much focused on food security, climate adaptation. 90% of our climate financing is in climate adaptation. As you can imagine, agriculture, food security, food systems, climate, it's very much interlinked. In the past, you had a different conversation, a climate narrative, a food systems narrative, food security. Now they have come together. And it's very clear from my conversations with many of the heads of state that the challenges are massive. If you talk about the president of Niger, their population is gonna triple. Most of the population there is under 15. They're gonna go from 23 million to 65 million. The type of challenges they have in the country, in the corridor, northern, southern, are very different. If you talk about Tajikistan, the president I met yesterday, they have melting glaciers. At the same time, the glaciers are melting, but they are managing 60% of the water of all Central Asia. If you talk today, I was talking to the president of Djibouti. Actually, they have come up with a whole transformation in terms of clean energy, energy renewable, financing of how they can just transition. They just don't have the money. We are currently working a lot on the Great Green Wall, different initiatives, 7 Sahel countries. In a second phase, we also want to work in Djibouti, but actually what we need is more financing. And many times we talk only about finance, but it's very important 2 things. One, how does this translate into the ground? What type of projects we're talking about? Everybody talks about COP27 being about adaptation. How do the projects look like? And I'll give you some small hints of how did they look like. And the second one, I'm also coming right now from another panel on the private sector. There was one of the big Canadian pension funds, 400 billion assets under management, and they want to know how they can do things on the ground. Start with a 1 billion pilot program, use our expertise, and this is the type of projects whereby we can combine the small-scale producers that we are actually working on an everyday basis and making sure that on a commercial basis they can also access the market. There was also Citigroup in the room and was talking about the risking, about the structure. So all of the details behind are very important. How do we connect the president of Djibouti, who has a very clear plan, with this 400 billion? How do we get them to talk the same language? This is what we need to figure out. Not only talking about the money, but actually how do we speak the same language? How do we de-risk? How we manage this at a programmatic level? Not project by project, but actually at a programmatic level. In the case of our sector, which is food systems, agriculture, food systems approach for us is about energy, it's about infrastructure, it's about agriculture, it's about even education. When you change the lives of the women, the rural poor women, that has a big impact in the education of the children. So actually, and we have a fantastic also program with the World Food Program in school meals, that we are working actually on how to source many and connect many of the local producers to the supply of the schools. So I think it's fundamental that we join forces. As you have said, it's not and or, I mean it needs to be and, there's no question. It's actually how do we speak the same language? How do we make sure that all of these projects and different sectors are coming together? In our case, we do bring the voices of the Youth Association, Women Association, Farmers Organization to make sure that the benefits of all of this also go to the people. It's not we're talking about the big type of project. And when we talk about climate adaptation in terms of agriculture, what are we talking about? Restoring wastelands, reforesting, replanting, small-scale irrigation systems, early warning systems. This is the type of issues. Also using technology in trying to support them into adapting. It also relates to mini-grids, to energy. So it's not only one factor. We need to bring all of the different areas and all of the different factors. And to end, we also need governments. In the case of agriculture and Africa, there was a commitment from the local governments to invest up to 10% of GDP. Only one government got close to that. Most of the poverty in the world is in the rural areas. 80% of the poor people are actually in the rural areas. And they're feeding most of us. They're feeding one-third of the world. And in the case of the low-income countries, 80% of the population is being fed by small-scale farmers. So actually, they are the people producing the food. And they are the people that we are seeing them lose their assets, having to sell their food, sell their land in order to feed themselves. So I don't want to end on the pessimistic note, but it's true that next year we're going to have an issue with the availability of fertilizers, and we're going to have an issue most likely with the availability of grain. So it's very important that we prepare ourselves and that we do not continue drifting from crisis to crisis. It has been a message from all the Rome-based agencies, including World Food Program, FAO, ourselves at IFAD. We have to invest also right now. It's not only about feeding and addressing. We're not going to address hunger just by feeding people food. We need to make sure that we make the investments now so that the next crisis doesn't happen in 3 or 5 years.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alvaro, for these words, and in particular to insist on the financing side, but also what kind of finance you need. And you raised 2 points, I mean, that are very important given your experience. One, how to translate into the ground, and here the adaptation policies are key. And the second point that you raised is how to connect the different projects. That is crucial, how to speak the same language. And at the end of the day, to work at the programmatic level, taking into consideration some coordination that you need, and to avoid the coordination failures that you can have, in particular in the most remote areas. So your call is clear. The investments that are needed today to achieve the goals that you and we have the commitment from the side of developing and developing countries. Let me now turn to Cecile and to talk about what you are doing at the SDSN network, and what you have in particular in mind in terms of how to make together development and climate change, because that's an issue in which certainly we can say in the reports, but probably in the ground, when you see the international cooperation and the activities that you're going to do, it's very important to see how to connect both the development goals that you have, more generally speaking, and the climate change. So please, Cecile, the floor is yours.
No? Yes. No, good. Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. I have to, first of all, admit that I feel much more comfortable being surrounded by development people than being by climate scientists. I feel much more at home with development people. But I'm joking, but in that joke is also a concern, and I think other UN colleagues might have a similar impression sometimes, that even though we see signs that things are coming together, there's sometimes also a sense as if, say, climate adaptation is becoming its own field separate from development. Maybe just to say, my organization, the SDSN, we are a think tank affiliated with the United Nations. We were created 10 years ago at the request of the Secretary General. We have more than 1,700 member organizations. They are mostly universities and research programs, quite a number of them in Spain actually, and we have a very active SDSN Spain network. So for all of you who are here from Spain, I think I have some postcards in the back. If you want, please contact us. And the idea really is very much that as much as governments are in the lead of the policy processes and of putting in place the financing and the policies to advance the SDGs, there's a lot that needs to come from civil society. There's a role for scientists. There's a role for other sectors as well. Of course, development itself has undergone a huge change over the last 30 years. We're now talking about sustainable development. Climate change is part of the idea of sustainable development. So we have seen, even before the SDGs with the Millennium Development Goals, sorry, I feel, can you hear me? Maybe this is better. We have already, with the Millennium Development Goals, we've seen, we've had 15 years of experience with a so-called goal-based approach, where you set targets and you try to work backwards from targets, and you try to figure out what are the kind of programs and policy interventions that can bring you those results. We have incorporated that in the SDGs. There's a whole lot of experience in development around modalities. We have in many sectors developed sector-wide approaches, sector programs. There's a lot of experience on how to implement across sectoral boundaries. There's a whole agenda we had for years on aid effectiveness. All of these lessons, all of this experience is very valuable now, and we need to make sure that climate benefits from that experience when we do adaptation programs. Now, of course, the focus is on implementation, but implementation is difficult under best of circumstances, and we're not having best of circumstances. So I think we need to make sure that in climate we're not repeating many of the mistakes we had for a long time in development, and we need to have a lot of people involved at all levels, especially in countries who are familiar with development and development planning and how to design good policies and how to adjust good policies. We know all of this, and frankly, you don't need to have studied climate science to be a good development professional, and I think a lot of potential of how development cooperation can fully support this, how it can integrate, and how implementation can become the most effective on the lessons of development. So with that said, just to say, I think depending on how you look at it, it looks like it's a different world, but ultimately we're talking about how to design effective policies, how to implement them, how to link them with finance, and how to make sure that they achieve the results we need to see. And yes, it's a different domain, and yes, we're talking about a lot more complexity sometimes than we do in development already, but ultimately this is about good practices and it's about good policy programs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cecil, for these words, and in particular to present more what you are doing. The SDSN, that you are based in Paris, actually. So now it's time. Now you can work together. I mean, we need to come to Egypt to meet each other and to discuss and to see what you are doing, because this is really important. How to involve the think tanks, the research institutes in the different projects, and how, at the end of the day, to have these different experiences that you have, and to see the importance of the planning, and how to implement these different programs and plans that you are working on. So that's a crucial aspect in the agenda, in particular when we talk about the adaptation policies. So thanks a lot for this presentation. Let me now leave the floor to Jennifer. Sarah, you are the Director of Climate Change Global Practice at the World Bank, and you launched the SCALE initiative. That is something really important for the world. So congratulations for this announcement and the launch of this SCALE initiative. But before going to that, probably you can highlight some experiences and your vision and your thoughts about how we can work together between international cooperation and climate change regarding the projects that the World Bank is doing around the world.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's delightful to be here, and I'm happy that you said you're a development professional. Is that working? Because that's what I'm the director for climate change at the World Bank, but for the 8 years before that, I was the director of water. I worked very closely with the government in Spain in water. And so bringing the water experience into climate is really interesting because for us, it's all about development and adaptation and, of course, mitigation, but from the perspective of development. So I very much embrace the nature of this panel because I think that's a really important perspective. Because development is about people, really. It's about delivering the SDGs on the ground in a way that takes into account climate change. I also really want to thank IEC for hosting this discussion today and the government of Spain being such a leader in the climate space. And I just want to touch briefly on 3 areas, Mr. Hariu. The need that we all have heard over and over again, the need to significantly boost climate financing, but also the importance of also what countries can do as they set out roadmaps to how to target which financing in the directions of travel, and then finally talk a bit about scale. And so for those of you who listened yesterday to the opening statements, and we've heard time and time again the need for the millions, the billions, the trillions. And it's a time when many, many countries face fiscal and economic challenges. And unfortunately, we're seeing in many poor countries poverty coming back again, after COVID especially. And so we realize that the lower income countries are really in particular at risk of being left behind from financing. With most of the global finance, it's about $630 billion a year. It's going to high income countries. And I think that's really important for us to keep on remembering that, because sometimes we have these numbers flowing around and we don't really think, what does it mean? And to just put that in perspective, the World Bank, we're the biggest financier from all the IFIs of climate finance, and we were very, very proud last year because we delivered a record of about $32 billion. 32 is very, very small if you think about it to all the low-income and middle-income countries, and that represents actually 60% of all the flows of all the IFIs put together. So the numbers game is important actually because we talk about we really, really, really need to mobilize more financing, but we need to target to where it's most needed as well. So we also see that the public and private finance and international development partners need to work hand in hand. Everyone's talking about how do we pool different forms of money together, put the puzzle together. But we also know that private sector solutions alone won't be possible. And even when we bring in public sector financing and blended finance, it's needed. But we see the important role of concessional finance. And I'm grateful that the government of Spain really, really is taking that to heart and recognizes concessional finance. It's not just the concessional finance that's given to AIDA and development banks, but also the grant financing. And we'll come back to that in a second. And also what's important when I come back is how do you target financing to high impact projects? How do you combine the grants with the loans and other sources of investment to lower income countries so they put together big national programs in the right policy context that can crowd in additional finance? Again, when we think about financing at a country level, sound analytics. Countries have so many development priorities, SDG priorities, climate imperatives. So it's very, very important also for them to think through how do we balance both the development needs and the climate needs. And so we've been putting together an analytical tool, you may have heard of them, called the Country Climate and Development Reports. And what it really does is to help inform policy decisions to prioritize achieving both development and the most impactful projects that can reduce GHG emissions while also boosting adaptation. We've published about 20 of these. We can share them with you later. They're quite exciting because they're the first real analytical tool that then helps countries transform these into long-term strategies and NDCs. And so supporting countries and being out in the front and setting their priorities and the planning we believe is so important. Let me now turn to the importance of carbon markets as an innovative way of also crowding in financing. When I first took this assignment in July, I went to Marrakesh because it was the Board of Governors meeting of all the Africa governors of the World Bank. And what they said throughout the whole meeting, I was really surprised, is please don't leave us behind in the carbon markets. Everybody in Europe, everyone's talking about carbon markets, but we also want to be able to participate. And so for that, we're very grateful because we've had a partnership also with Spain and many others with the Program for Market Readiness and Implementation for the last 20 years. I mean, this has been really thinking through how do we work together at country level to build development countries' capacity to also participate in these carbon markets that are evolving in different forms and shapes, voluntary, not. The core to any kind of carbon market is to have both the supply and demand. And there's a lot of demand we see now, especially from the private sector. The supply is really, really important. The supply of good quality, verifiable emissions. And that's what's really, really important. How do you have good quality, verifiable emissions? And there's already a lot of questioning now about the quality of many emissions. And so that's exactly what we're trying to do is scale. And scale is called Scaling Climate Action by Lowering Emissions. And it's helping to address the supply and demand challenge. And we had a nice event this morning with the President of the World Bank and the Presidents of Tanzania and Mozambique, as well as the Vietnam Minister of Natural Resources, to think through what it means to help countries to design these types of emissions credit reductions. So scale will bridge the climate finance gap by pooling funding from the global community and providing grant payments on a results basis to client countries against these verifiable greenhouse gas emission reductions. But most importantly for us is the development side of it. How do you enable local communities and indigenous peoples to have access to the climate finance? And let me just go through an example for Mozambique, if it's okay. Do I have time? So I think in 2008, we started working with the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility. Many of you might have heard of it, the FCPF, to help Mozambique lay the groundwork on being able to create these large-scale emissions reductions in the forestry sector. And it took so many years to actually come up with mobilizing the communities, being able to do the reforestation, to be able to certify it, to verify and certify it. And for the first time ever, we're excited because we've been able to sign an emissions reductions payment agreement with the government, which will provide $50 million in results-based payments for the reduction of $10 million of 10 million tons of carbon dioxide emissions. And this program importantly includes conservation, climate-smart agriculture, sustainable supply chains for cash crop production, multi-purpose plantations. It's a series of initiatives where land restoration, you put it all together and develops the development benefits, captures the climate emissions, and is then be able to pay the communities and pay the government and through the governments to the communities for this. So in October 2021, Mozambique became the first country ever in the world to receive payment from the FCPF of $6.4 million for these verified emissions that were produced by local communities. And this is the first of 4 scheduled payments they will have for this program. So again, stakeholder engagement, participation of all is very important at the grassroots level, but of course you need government support in framing of this so that you can actually channel the verified emissions into a government program. Initially it could be stay with the government at the public sector level, but eventually governments could decide to also trade and sell these emissions to outside to a global carbon market. So let me just wrap up. It looks like I'm running out of time. We did launch the initiative on scale this morning that's going to help crowding grant financing to accompany IDA and IBRD lending so that the lending would be able to do the development impact, and the grant component does pay then for the emissions reductions over time and it's for a high quality, high integrity market. And that's what's important. If you have enough countries creating these emissions reductions that are high quality, you're starting to create a market. And that's what we're trying to do. And finally, this is building, very, very important to always put the country first, to build the capacity of the countries for them to be able to manage these carbon markets and crowd in then additional payments. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jennifer, for these words, and in particular to insist on how it's important to mobilize resources, but also how to coordinate together. In particular, thanks for this initiative that you are working on a scale. The carbon market certainly is a crucial agenda, not only for developing countries, but also, as you mentioned, for developed countries. So that's an ongoing agenda, and here the work that you are doing with your reports, how to prioritize as well, and the example that you gave for Mozambique, that's great to hear in the ground what you are doing. Now let me turn the floor, and it's an honor to give the floor to the Minister of Water Resources and Irrigation from Egypt. Minister, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Mr. Seguilam, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. I don't know, do you hear anything? You know, academicians always would like to stand up. They don't like sitting somehow. Anyway, thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you for organizing this event. And I think international development cooperation for climate change is very crucial, because there is no achievement, especially if we speak here in this COP about implementation on the ground, then cooperation is necessary. We have been talking in the previous COPs a lot about planning, thinking, policy, and I think it is the time now to implement on the ground. And as I said, implementation without cooperation doesn't work. Here, as a Minister of Water Resources, I would like to focus on the water dimension of climate change. Imagine that the Paris Agreement does not include the word water. So it's quite strange for us, and I think this is my objective in this COP, is to promote water to be positioned at the heart of climate change. That's what we are trying to do. That's why we organized the Cairo Water Week last month, one full week focusing on putting and positioning water at the heart of climate change. You cannot speak about climate change, adaptation or mitigation without including water. That doesn't work. And this is really the challenge that we are trying to face here. If water is a key word for us in this COP, but also Africa is another key word that we would like to consider. Africa is suffering from the impact of climate change, and they have very minimum responsibility of what's happening, and we all know that, and I don't want to repeat it. And since we are speaking about implementation, we are putting an initiative, it's a global initiative for actions in water to cope with the adaptation and resilience of the African continents. But in a global context, we would like to collaborate, as the title of this session, in order to implement actions on the ground in Africa. So this initiative is called AWARE, Actions for Water Adaptation and Resilience, that some of you, I'm sure, have received the document, and the document's available. It's putting a clear thematic work areas for implementation, specific projects to be implemented in Africa, mainly focusing on building the capacity, because Africans, they need capacity building. They need to decouple economic growth from fresh water, which is one of the pillars of the initiative, focusing on decoupling economic growth from freshwater use and degradation. Africa has to grow, and growing should not be on the cost of water in terms of quantity and quality, and that's what we would like to decouple. Green water is accounted for developing national utilization plans, adaptation and mitigation, so the dimension of green water should be considered. Transboundary cooperation for the adaptation, co-benefits and adaptation actions in the field of mitigation, improved early warning system to tackle and identify the hydrological extremes, whether drought or floods, linking water resources policies and climate change actions. So these are 6 pillars of the initiatives that we are putting on the table, and we would like to establish a capacity building hub for Africa. That's the main objective that we would like to reach. We would be able to host it in Egypt. We will provide infrastructure for that based on what exists in the country from infrastructure, and we want nodes in different African countries to build the African capacities in these 6 thematic areas, but we are open for other thematic areas that expressing interests from the African countries or from the donors to help them on that. I invite you for the promotional session on the 9th of November at the Water Pavilion, somewhere here in the corner. And also the launching of this initiative is on the 14th of November during the Water Day. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Minister, for this intervention, in particular to insist on the role of water, I mean, at the center of the climate change, and how it's important to have water policies when we talk about climate change in all the countries around the world. Actually, at the OECD, more than 15 years ago, water was not in the agenda in the organization, and then the former Secretary General insists water should be one key pillar of the agenda of the OECD. So we are completely in line with your thoughts, and in particular the initiative for Africa that you are leading, that is very important for the continent. So with that, thank you very much for this first panel, and I think that we had important experiences, but also some lessons to continue working on climate change and development in emerging economies, but also in developing countries, and how international organizations, people working with think tanks and researchers, governments, of course, can work together to make the most of the climate change with development. At the end, I see that is what you are doing. I mean, development is at the center, and now we need to insist more on the climate change agenda. The needs are important, and that's why Jennifer insists a lot as well. So thanks very much for this first panel. Let me join to applaud the different panelists.
¿Quieres que te traiga?
Okay. Okay, so let's start the second panel, that is more on how to mainstream climate change and in particular climate action across international development programs and projects. So in this panel, the idea is how to promote at the end a just and green transition, and for that, how to mainstream these different projects and programs that we have. So again, as we said at the beginning, we have a panel with different actors working on the ground, and this is very important for us at the OECD that we are not so in the ground. And let me start with Ute, that you are the Deputy Executive Director of Partnerships and Advocacy at the World Food Programme. So certainly your experience is very important on how to manage all these different programs and projects.
Yeah, thank you very much. I hope it's working. It's working.
I can hear you.
It's working. I want to be an advisor for Anton, no? How he is prioritizing, the allocation, because listening to the first panel, what is very clear in the moment we are talking about a humanitarian intervention and operation, and WFP is one of the largest humanitarian actors. We are actually, we have to realize in the moment humanitarian interventions are needed, a lot of intervention has failed before. So the question really is, what is the advice? How are we organizing, funds for the increase of climate response, increase of humanitarian needs, and the SDG agenda as such? And in my discussion with Anton, we are discussing simply one concept. It's about nexus. How are, the development, domain is speaking to the humanitarian domain. And I am in slight disagreement with our previous speaker from the Solution Network, because I don't see climate as a kind of specialized crowd and experts. We have to integrate in all what we do. We have to integrate climate action into our programs, be it humanitarian, be it development, and there is this humanitarian development peace climate nexus concept, and we have to follow that, breaking down the silos and connecting the dots. And I have to say, colleagues, I feel a lot of kind of commitment that we are connecting the dots, and that's good, that we are speaking to each other, really, coming together. And I want to share with you two issues. I mean, what is so important to really to have on our agenda in terms of fundraising and available funding to respond to climate issues. Non-fragile states receive 80 times more climate finance than extremely fragile states per person per year. So what does it say to us? We have to start with the most vulnerable first, period. If we are not addressing altogether the most vulnerable in most fragile settings, it will in a way prompt a cascade of problems. So the most vulnerable first, and listening also to the diversification of funding resources. What is so important, and I was really diving deep with my team into the resources of funding. I wanted to really alert you that the private sector funding is exclusively allocated to mitigation, to climate mitigation. And Anton, there is no plan. The global community has not developed a model how we attract private sector funding for climate adaptation. Now so just imagine you are in a most fragile setting. So number one, your state has no fiscal space. In fact, it's shrinking fiscal space, in terms of getting loans. You are not receiving public funding for climate adaptation, and on top of that, you are not heard. So we have this triple effect for the most vulnerable. I stop here because I think for our agenda, it's so important that we are focusing our instruments, exactly on that setting, and coming back to the conversation we're having with a lot of donors, and I'm negotiating with a lot of donors, we have to really bring all these kind of instruments together. And the IFAD president was really talking also about the different kind of topics. Sarah was talking about the carbon market. The minister was talking about water. All of that has to come together in integrated resilience programs. That's my last word. In the moment we are not investing in crisis prevention and in anticipatory action, I'm saying that 3 times, anticipatory action. That's the most smart and intelligent way to invest and address the climate challenge. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clamer, for this intervention, and to insist on, your call is clear. To go beyond the silos and how to improve the nexus, and we are doing some efforts to increase the interlinkages that we have, but the interlinkages still, we are not working so good still with the different nexus that we have. So certainly that's a key point in the agenda, and also you mentioned something that we need to insist more probably, and that's a word that all the organizations should insist more, and it's about adaptation policies and the financing of these adaptation policies, because we see, and that's true, we see a lot of initiatives from the private sector on mitigation, but not in adaptation. So that's a crucial point. Let me now turn the floor to the Undersecretary of Environment of Chile, Minister Juan Maximiliano Proaño. Normally it should work. So Chile is an interesting case because it's a high-income country in terms of GDP per capita. It's a OECD member country, but certainly, and I hope that you agree with me, still we have some challenges in terms of development, and we see development in a multidimensional perspective. So when we go beyond GDP, certainly the case of Chile is an interesting one on how we can increase the international cooperation beyond the ODA. So I want to hear from you your experience as a minister of at the Ministry of Environment, and to see how far we can go in terms of international cooperation in a high-income country as the case of Chile. Undersecretary. Close. No, we cannot hear you.
Oh yeah? Yeah. I said that without a doubt, Chile is facing big challenges. Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, first of all, I would like to thank the Spanish Agency for International Development Cooperation for inviting us to take part of this important panel. Climate change is a key issue of our time, everyone knows. It's true that the world must act quickly, but the solution must be just. The worst effect of climate change, such as more intense storms, dangerous heat waves, more frequent and longer lasting droughts, and rising sea levels, largely affect vulnerable people, who in turn contribute the least to the problem. The 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals, including one of climate change on climate action, provide the best framework for addressing the climate emergency in a way that helps everyone, particularly women, children, youth, elderly, people with disabilities, and those living in small island development states. Climate change is more than just one of the 16 Sustainable Development Goals specified in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. It is a threat multiplier, multidimensional, with the potential to worsen some of humanity's greatest challenges, such as health, poverty, and hunger. The importance of cooperation in this context as a privileged instrument of the relationship between nations lies in the possibility of facing common challenges through exchanges in specific fields in which there are strengths and needs, representing an opportunity for the creation and strengthening of institutional capacities. It has several ideas that I would like to share with you with a certain freedom without obeying any prioritization or hierarchy. Cooperation in environmental matters obvious to different sources, some with greater institutionalism and trajectory, as in the case of cooperation in the context of GEF projects, and in some free trade agreements, or through the establishment of specific interinstitutional instruments between agencies with competence in environmental matters in Chile and their counterparts in other countries through memorandums or understanding declaration of intent. I would now like to briefly list the criteria that should promote or encourage cooperative initiatives. First, relevance. Essentially examine the objectives of the projects in relationship with the institutional priorities, the context and relevant policies. Second, effectiveness. Analyze the specific objectives and expected results. Ensure that they are precise, verifiable and realistic, thus facilitating progress monitoring. Third, efficiency. Measure that achievement of expected results in relation to the resources involved, financial, material, technical and human. Feasibility refers to the availability of resources, time and professionals, political will and institutional priorities. Decentralization. This is very important for countries as Chile, that we are a very centralized country, and now is currently a development problem. Decentralization oriented to the incorporation of the regions to contribute to their development. Impact is the last. It will try to perceive the achievement of the objective, analyze any possible effect or consequence of the initiative, incorporate a logic of higher impact projects instead of several isolated and limited activities. This is the only way to for institutions to ensure that international cooperation will have an impact on their public policies. Triangular cooperation is essential to close climate gaps in Chile and in Latin America. With the graduation of Chile from official development assistance, the financing to develop activities and programs for the fulfillment of international commitments became more complex. Despite being part of the OECD, Latin American countries still have significant gaps in relation to compliance with the 2030 agenda, and in areas such as environmental democracy and climate change demonstrated the development problems and multidimensional and cannot be measured exclusively by GDP per capita. Chile recognized the need to continue improving the Sustainable Development Goals indicators. Development problems are multidimensional and therefore recognize the importance of bilateral partnerships as a mechanism for the continuous improvement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Cooperation should go beyond mere financing. Chile recognized the importance of the transferring knowledge, experiences and good practices in climate policies. Chile shares common interests in different areas of climate action, such as greenhouse gases emission reduction, low emission development strategies, measurement, reporting and review of climate protection measures, access to climate information, climate risk and vulnerability assessment, feminism foreign policy, socio-ecological just transition, green hydrogen, climate finance, climate change framework law, long-term climate strategy, climate action for the territories, strengthening the NDC by integrating methane emission reduction, a presentation of the adaptation communication, etc. For all of the reasons, Chile is definitely is willing to continue cooperating through bilateral mechanisms or implementation agencies. We emphasize the interest of continuing deploy climate action in the country and the region, particularly through cooperation between the Aarhus Convention and the Escazú Agreement to promote the protection of access rights and environmental defenders, and thus advance the implementation of agreement in Latin American countries and Caribbean countries. Confronting climate change requires decisive action by all actors, and Escazú Agreement is the tool for ambitious action on democracy, environmental democracy. International efforts to accelerate decarbonization have a different effect on developing countries whose energy matrices really rely heavily on international companies that are driven to climate ambition. By increasing resilience, more resilient communities enable a faster transition with greater chances of success. A local community that is better prepared to face a climate crisis can think and implement medium and long-term actions with sustainability criteria. A community less prepared for the climate crisis must allocate more effort to emerging issues, in many cases of survival, and therefore put urgencies such as a daily sustenance before sustainability criteria. From the point of view, international programs and projects have made a concrete contribution in increasing the resilience of communities and ecosystems to increase their resilience, either through early warning system, ecosystem restoration, and protection, capacity building, technological innovation, among others. Finally, the development of clean technologies requires long-term investment, with decisive impulses from various international actors to position them as economically viable as well as environmentally friendly options. However, for this type of technologies, as green hydrogen, to have a long-term foothold, they also need to be designed considering the territories, local communities where they will be installed, ensuring that benefits are shared and that any impact is properly assessed and mitigated, meeting the highest environmental standards. For this, international cooperation, either through projects or sharing experiences, is key. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Undersecretary of Environment, for this intervention. In particular, I will highlight 3 points. The first one is on the triangular cooperation, something that we have not discussed before today, and this is really important, the triangular cooperation perspective and how in the climate agenda is important. Second aspect, to go beyond the financing side, the finance, when we talk about cooperation. You mentioned the importance of the transfer of knowledge, of technology, and to share good practices in climate policy. So that's really important, in particular when we talk about the local level. And you insist a lot in the case of Chile on disparities that you have at the local level in the case of Chile. And last but not least, the Escazú Agreement, so this regional perspective on cooperation that is needed in Latin American economies that, of course, we share. And thanks again for your participation yesterday of the launch of the Latin American Economic Outlook, where we insist a lot on the regional agenda for Latin America. Let me now leave the floor to the representative from Oxfam, Jacobo Ocharan. You are the lead of the Global Climate Initiative at Oxfam. Oxfam, as we all know, is a key actor when we talk about justice, when we talk about inequalities. And here, I mean, it would be great to see at the end, and following your point, on how they are together. I mean, development, in particular, how to boost equity and climate change. So, please, Jacobo.
No, you got, okay, thank you.
Now we can
So thanks a lot for everybody who are resisting here at this part of the end of the day, and thanks a lot to Acid for inviting us, inviting Oxfam. First of all, that I would like to say is if on how development can support the fight against the climate crisis agenda, I will say not doing business as usual, not doing on how it's been done up to now, okay? When I was hearing to you, Anton, at the beginning saying, you know, by 2030 Spain is going to reach 0.7, oh my God, I was camping back in the 90s, okay, for getting 0.7%, okay? So it's going to take us to Spain, it's going to take us 30 plus years, okay, to get that. It's everybody's fault, I'm not pointing anybody, but it's the times, okay? It's going to take us 30 plus years to get to 0.7. Well, unfortunately, we have no time. We have no 30 years to reach any of the agreements that they were taken in Paris and the subsequent agreements that we have to fight against the climate crisis, okay? If you take the international community, the different governments, the citizens, 30 plus years to take the actions that we have agreed, because I mean, those young here, you probably don't remember, the 0.7, it was an agreement, okay, it was an agreement, okay, but it's never been implemented. If it takes 30 years plus to get to this agreement, we are not going to, I mean, time is clicking and is no way to stop it, okay, so if we don't move, it's going to be, I don't know how to say it, but catastrophic. So I like how you put it, Tute, on saying, you know, the world needs to be in a nexus. We work it, we were mentioning at the beginning, with an inequality point of view. At the end of the day, it's a matter of inequality. Climate crisis is increasing inequality, and because inequality is increasing, the climate crisis is getting worse. Okay, so it's getting bigger. And we talk about inequality about three main axes. One of them is on emissions, okay? Take it as you know, at the beginning we were taking how much Africa is responsible. I think you were mentioning, Anton, how, you know, the small responsibility that Africa has on the emissions and the big suffering that is going through it. You can count it as you want, okay? So this year, for instance, we are coming here as Oxfam saying that the top 100 richest person in the world, when we put together the assets, their investments, their profits, they pollute as much as all France together. So it will be more than all Spain together, okay? This is just 100 people, okay? The 100 Forbes most richest people, okay? So the inequalities, and obviously, and the inequalities of the consequences, because these people probably, not just these 100, that the richest people, those of us that we are meeting the most, are the ones that are suffering the less. The second axis of inequality is about climate finance, okay? Climate finance, no need to say, again, we are not reaching the agreement, we are not reaching the 100 billion agreement that we had in Paris, okay? There is different calculations. It seems that we are on 70, on 80. We can tell you that, you know, also in our reports, we have only 30,000 million on on non-concessional help. Okay, so this is what we have. So, and now we are discussing. They are discussing, because I cannot discuss. So I will say they are discussing. Okay, the new goal, and it's not just about the figure, but it's making sure that we are putting this on needs. And the third axis of inequality is about, probably I should put it the first, but I don't know why I have it here the less, is the access to decision making. Okay, the access to decision making in this place, the access to decision making in all the countries, locations where the climate crisis is affecting, and the people that is most affected has not a voice. Okay, or it has not a voice that is taking steps. Okay, so all of these three is cross, and I will say it clear, by a patriarchal society that is generating and is responsible for this part of the crisis. So we need to find, is not how we mainstream gender, but it's how we go to the axis of an approach that is fighting on the inequality on emissions, fighting on the inequality on the finance, and fighting on the inequality on access to power. Okay, I will stop it here because I know that we are tight of time, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jacobo, for this intervention that is crucial to see the different inequalities that we have, and certainly we have more. I mean, because you mentioned just one in terms of the richest population. That's something that we can observe within countries, but also across countries, right?
Yeah.
And at the end, the most vulnerable population is more affected by the climate change. So that's an issue in which we need to keep in mind. So again, I'm not here to promote my report, but that's something that we mentioned in the Latin American Economic Outlook as well. Let me now turn the floor to Maria, and that's before going to the conclusions, the last speaker, but not the least, because this is really important to hear the youth, and in particular the experiences that you have done in Sierra Leone. I learned that today, and that's something that I think important to share with all of us. Maria, please.
Yes. Okay. Can you hear me? No. Hola? Hola? Sí? Okay. So, hello. Thank you very much. No?
No.
Like this? Here? Más? Okay. Here? Okay, sorry. Okay, thank you very much. I'm here with also my colleagues and friends. We are a team of youth people that are in the Spanish delegation. And as you say here, exactly, we came here because we have a project that we want to implement in Sierra Leone, in Makeni. Our project is about participatory mapping for the risk of flooding in this city, in Makeni. So the time to act is now. We know that, and we also think that we should involve all generations in this solution making. We are now, this project is about, it has two approaches. The first one is the risk management approach. We need it now. We need to prevent, we need to plan, and we need to adapt our cities, our countries to these disasters that are already taking place in the planet. They are not to the future, they are now. So we need to act now. And the second approach we take is the citizen science. We live in a very complex world with a big variety of complex information. So to take all this information is not easy to do it just from the scientific point of view. We need the people, we need to involve all the people to generate this data so we can create better solutions. We can have more point of view. Well, and about of this, we also talk about, for example, maps, because we live in a global society, so mapping is a way to show information. It breaks the language barriers. Anyone with different language, we can read this map. So for us, it's a very common language that we can all understand. It's okay? Okay. So, well, we wanted to introduce you to this project, and we want we also should promote the bottom-up lines of work, so we can involve youth voices in all the processes. We need to have all these point of views in the solutions, because we are all taking the consequences. So, well, I feel that's all our approach. So thank you very much for taking the place to share it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Maria, for your intervention, in particular to insist on this call for action and what you are doing right now in Makeni, in Sierra Leone. That is an example, I mean, that at the end is how to expand around the world, and in particular in Latin America is also something very, very useful. So now let me just give the floor to Anton Leis to conclude this event today with these two panels. I just want to thank all the panelists. You did very interesting interventions. You went to the point and you made my work, because we are on time thanks to you. And just now we have the 5 minutes of conclusions to Anton Leis, the director of the Spanish Agency for International Cooperation and Development.
Thank you. You can hear me, right? Yeah. Okay. This is probably the oldest microphone I've used. Well, let me join Sebastián in thanking our panel. All of them, Ute, Maria, Jacobo, Maximilian, and the previous panel as well. As a token of recognition, they're going to get old-fashioned Spanish adaptation. It's a fan. It's actually the most precious gift of Spanish development cooperation, a red fan. It's well known. We have pens and other things, but the fan is actually the most precious. A bit more seriously, I think I would like to react to some of the things that have been mentioned in this panel, and I think we talk about some of the buzzwords we are using in this COP, implementation, Africa. I think to some extent it's also a matter of alignment, no? Aligning all our efforts. It's a question of aligning sectors, and we talk a lot about climate action, mitigation, adaptation, but we talk about the role of small farmers, small growers, so resilient and sustainable agriculture systems. The question of water, absolutely fundamental, and we heard the minister mentioning that water is mentioned as a word, but water is very much a climate agenda. We need to mainstream climate in all we do. In the Spanish agency, we have mainstreamed it even in humanitarian operations. When we display our hospital, our field hospital, we try to make sure that we are close to zero emissions, no? In everything we do. It's also a matter of aligning zero emissions, no? In everything we do. It's also a matter of aligning climate with other competing objectives, and I think Jacobo and others have mentioned this. We need to listen to developing countries. It's adaptation, is early warning systems, is resilience, is loss and damages, and we'll see how that discussion evolves here, because whatever is not picked by adaptation is picked by hopefully some sort of loss and damage mechanism. And if not, we pick it as humanitarian work. What happened in Pakistan, we send a really little amount of money, let's put bluntly, from humanitarian aid to a country that has suffered multi-billion losses from an adverse climate. And we need to find a solution for that. But it's also the social as well, or eco-social, as Maximiliano and like to say. I was just in Bolivia, that was my last trip, and I think the #1 component of our next program for Bolivia for the next 4 years is going to be the just transition. And we're going to be working on biodiversity projects, preserving the forest, but working with indigenous communities. When we talk about climate change, we talk about some of this work that we need to do on mitigation and on preserving biodiversity. The costs are disproportionately falling on indigenous communities and other underprivileged, underrepresented groups, and this is absolutely fundamental. And I think Jacobo mentioned the question of voice, or democracy, I would say. There is another transition that we need to go through, which is that of voice. We need to have spaces of engagement with civil society, with youth as well. This is a intergenerational dialogue, and there is of course the legacy of a broke planet, or a planet that young generations will never. But there is the question of debt as well. When we talk about financing, is how much can we do this through debt to countries that are highly indebted already, no? And I think that's actually, I mentioned Bolivia as my last trip. My next trip is actually going to go to Sevilla, to the meeting of the Global Forum of Tax Transparency, another great initiative of the OECD, previous employer, for full disclaimer, because it's absolutely fundamental. I mean, this is going to cost a lot of money, and a lot of this will come from the private sector. A lot of this, or a significant portion of this, was a bit critical of 0.7. It's 170 billion dollars or euros is the same now that ODA represents. But it can play a catalytic role. Let's see how close to 0.7 we get. But it's absolutely fundamental that there is domestic resource mobilization. And I think fair and sufficient tax revenue is absolutely fundamental. And it's also a question of aligning instruments, the financing, and we talk about the role of IFIs, we talk about the role of financial markets, also technical cooperation, and also humanitarian work. And I think this is blurred. Ute mentioned, the limits between humanitarian aid and longer term, or traditionally understood as longer term cooperation, are being blurred. We have the nexus, but we need to perhaps even go beyond the nexus too. Like we need to think long term when we do short term, because we have the house on fire and we can spend all our efforts on putting away the fire, but we need to build systems as well, so happen in the future, or that when they do, the consequences are minimized. And I think there's an alignment of actors. Like we need the governments at the helm, and we had Maximiliano presenting the experience of Chile, and Chile is actually one of the leaders, I would say, in Latin America in spearheading climate efforts. Certainly, we hope to see a lot of that Chilean voice in the multilateral agenda, particularly as Spain, we chair the EU presidency in the second half of 2023, and we want to look and engage with Latin America, with Chile and all other Latin American countries in some of these on the climate one, also development and also the social transition. But more generally, we need to work, all of us, bilateral donors, multilateral donors, NGOs, civil society, research institutions, because the challenge that we have ahead of us is just is absolutely huge and untractable unless we all work together. And I think that's the message we want to convey with this discussion, is that yes, we need to talk, the climate scientists, the climate negotiators, and the development practitioners, because we need to get the work going. That's the main message our Egyptian hosts are sending all of us. We need to work on implementation, and that's what we will do as soon as we leave this room. So thank you very much for participating. Thank you to the panelists. You'll get the fun, and the rest of you get the fun with you. So thank you. Bye-bye.